So Good Friday, the Friday before Easter Sunday, is about remembering the betrayal of Jesus and the Judas kiss, Christ's arrest, and Jesus before the Sanhedrin as the Jewish leaders gathered together and looked feverishly for evidence to condemn Jesus to death. Many testified against Jesus that day, but their statements didn't make any sense since they were giving false and conflicting testimony. So the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are giving against you now?" But to these false accusations, Jesus gave no answer. He remained silent. Then when the high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" Jesus answered, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." The high priest tore his clothes and exclaimed, "Why do we need any more witnesses? You've heard this blasphemy." The crowds responded unanimously, saying Jesus was worthy of death. Some began to spit on him. They blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and taunted him. The guards then took Jesus and beat him. Very early the next morning, the chief priests with the elders and the whole Sanhedrin bound Jesus and handed him over to Pilate and publicly accused him of many things. Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" To which Jesus replied, "You have said so." The chief priest accused Jesus of many things, but Jesus remained silent. Pilate again asked Jesus, "Aren't you going to answer?" Jesus still remained silent, much to Pilate's amazement. As was the custom at the festival, Pilate would release a prisoner that the crowds requested. When Pilate asked the people if he should release Jesus, the chief priests stirred the crowd to call upon Pilate to release Barabbas. At that time, they were holding Barabbas, a notorious prisoner who had committed murder during his uprising. So when the people gathered and Pilate asked, "Which man do you want me to release?" they claimed Barabbas. They wanted Barabbas released. Pilate did this because he knew that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him out of jealousy. While Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat, his wife sent him a message. It said, "Have nothing to do with that righteous man, because today I've suffered terribly due to a dream I had about him." But the high priest and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas and to demand that Jesus be put to death. The governor asked him, "Which of these two men do you want me to release?" And the crowds responded, "Barabbas." So Pilate asked the crowd, "What should I do with Jesus?" And they say, unanimously, "Let him be crucified." Unanimously, "Let him be crucified." Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that a riot was about to happen. So he took some water, washed his hands in front of the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. Attend to this matter yourselves." Pilate allowed mob justice to rule. The people shouted, "Let his blood be on us and our children." The governor's soldiers took Jesus into the imperial headquarters, gathered with the whole company of soldiers around him. They stripped Jesus. They made him a crown of thorns. They placed it on his head, put a stick in his hand, and then they mockingly knelt in front of him, making fun of him, saying, "Long live the King of the Jews." Crucifixion was invented by the Persians between 300 and 400 BC. It is quite possibly the most painful death ever invented by humankind. The English language derives the word excruciating from the word crucifixion, acknowledging it as a form of slow, painful suffering. This punishment was reserved for slaves, foreigners, revolutionaries, and the most violent of criminals. Jesus was forced to carry the horizontal portion of his cross to Golgotha, where he was crucified. Atop the cross lay a sign indicating a formal charge had occurred and that the victim Jesus had been found guilty of claiming to be the King of the Jews. Jesus spoke 7 times on that cross. The first was, my God, why have you forsaken me? Indicating that this was a real traumatic encounter that Jesus had in death. And then the second time Jesus spoke, he said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they're doing. Then one of the criminals who was hanging on the cross said to Jesus, aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself with us. But the other criminal rebuked him. Don't you fear God, he said. Since you're under the same sentence, we are punished justly. We are getting what our crimes deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong. Then he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Jesus answered, I tell you the truth, today you will be with me in paradise. Then Jesus compassionately looks at his mother standing at the foot of the cross, and he says to his mother, your son John, and he looks to John, and he says to John, your mother. He made provision on the cross that his mother would be taken responsibility by John. John would look after him from that day. So even on the cross, Jesus had compassion to remember his mother and make provision for her. Then the 5th time Jesus spoke, he said simply this, I am thirsty. I am thirsty. The 6th time he spoke, he said, it is finished. The Father had sent Jesus to teach the gospel, to perform miracles, to achieve reconciliation for the people through sacrifice. The debt of Adam's sin was finally dealt with. And by the death, this sacrifice of Jesus was dealt with. It is finished. Jesus brought into completion all the Old Testament prophets. Jesus called out in a loud voice, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Jesus did this willingly for you and I. And he chose it. He chose death for you and I. This task was traumatic and overwhelming, and Jesus did it willingly. Hanging on the cross for 3 hours, Jesus finally gave up his life. He alone had authority over his life. Matthew 20:28 says, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. The crucifixion was God's plan before creation. He was the Lamb that was slain from the foundation of the world. But Jesus' death is still death. It's still an abomination. Just because Jesus submitted himself to death, it doesn't mean that everything was right. No, the author of life was murdered by evil men. And Jesus yielded his life to this evil and injustice because he knew who was really in charge. Billy Graham said, we call it Good Friday because on that day, salvation became a reality. Christians believe Christ's death on Good Friday and resurrection on Easter Sunday is a sacrifice that God said paid the price of our sins. We deserve to die, but Christ died in our place, said Billy Graham. The story of Easter doesn't end here. Easter is also the celebration of the resurrection of Jesus from the tomb on the third day. And I believe we'll come together on Sunday to celebrate that resurrection.